Honey, what's your hurry? Won't you stay inside? Remember not to get too close to the stars. They're never gonna give you love like ours. Where did you go? I should know, but it's cold and I don't wanna be lonely. So show me the way home. I can't lose another life. Try not to upset you, let you rescue me the day I met you. I just wanted to protect you, but now I'll never get you. It's a lie. Honey, what's your hurry? won't you stay inside? Remember not to get too close to the stars. They're never gonna give you love like ours. Where did you go? I should know, but it's cold and I don't wanna be lonely. So show me the way home. I can't lose another love.
Hello, good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining me here for this webinar. This will be a lecture around 90 minutes, 2 hours. This lecture will be held in English. I know that there are some people from different countries watching this. I know most people are from Portugal, but we have people from other countries, so I decided to hold it in English. My name is Luís Mesquita. I'm a Portuguese physiotherapist, and the main topic for today will be return to performance. The what, the why, the how, and when. So this is a very important topic not only for physiotherapists, but also for physical coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, sports science. So this is a topic that can bring all other areas together. Starting to present myself. So my name is Luís Mesquita. As I said, I'm a Portuguese physiotherapist. I have a background in strength and conditioning as well. I have experience working with different sports, especially in professional football, volleyball, track and field, and roller hockey. I worked in Portugal. I'm currently working in Portugal. I'm one of the owners of a company called The Peak. But in the past, I had also experience working in China. In China, I worked in professional football, and I worked with professional track and field as well in preparation for the Chinese national games in 2017. So I will just give you a video, a small demonstration of some of the work I did in China, and after we will kick off this lecture. So this is some of the work that I developed in China, both with football players and track and field athletes, mainly throwers. And to kick off this presentation, since it's something about returning to performance, so it's related to sports injuries, and now we can deal with it, making our athletes ready to play again and to compete again. Before we talk about what is this thing of returning to performance, let's see what performance truly is. This is one of my favorite videos that we normally show in our courses, and this is what I consider truly peak performance.
Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. West throws it up. Believe in miracles. I took up the world. I took up the world. I took up the world.
Facing tempest and doubt, I'm fighting till the end.
Yes! He drops for World Cup glory.
Creatures of my dreams rise up and dance with me.
Jordan to the circle, puts the shot in the air. Good! Boise State has won the Tostitos Fiesta. Gretzky! Finish here. Brilliant from Messi. Oh, what a goal! He got the shot! Intercepted at the goal line.
It does not matter if you are a physiotherapist, a sports coach, a strength and conditioning coach, a sports scientist. All in elite sports, we should not forget that our main goal should be towards winning. So we work with athletes because we want athletes and teams to win. And this is very important to realize because whether we are talking about return to performance, whether we are talking about training, we don't want just athletes to be great athletes in a gym. We don't want them just to be great in testing batteries. What we truly want is for them to win. And this is very important for us to realize because sometimes we just want to have the biggest squat or the heaviest squat in the weight room. We just want to have the best 10-meter split time. And in the end, what truly matters is winning. So especially for this presentation, we are going to talk about return to performance, but we should not forget that our main goal, even in return to performance, is to make players win again. When it comes to return to performance, in this presentation, the order that I'm going to divide this will be into 4 steps. So as I said, the title of this presentation is Return to Performance: the whats, the whys, the how, and when. We will start with what. What is this thing of return to performance? There's something there's a term, a phrase, a title that I like, that it's called Bridging the Gap from Rehabilitation to Performance. So this is also the name for a website, a blog that I created. And this truly summarizes what's the goal of this lecture, is to bridge the gap from the moment that someone has an injury, from rehabilitation, all the way to the time when they are ready to compete again. So traditionally, we see rehabilitation as an injury body part. So sometimes we even say that, oh, I'm treating an ACL. While this approach makes sense in terms of an injury, it does not prepare the athlete for the demands of his sport and the demands of competition. So traditionally, if we have a knee injury, for example, we focus mainly around the knee, and when the knee has mobility, local strength, no pain, no swelling, we decide that the injury is rehabilitated, so the athlete soon can return to play again. Scientific research doesn't agree with this traditional approach. Over the last years, research has been telling us that this is not an effective way to rehabilitate and to make our athletes ready to compete again. And as we will see afterwards, there is a big re-injury rate in sports. So probably this traditional approach is not the right path to go when we have an injured athlete. When we talk about science-informed approach, and I like this term of science-informed instead of evidence-based, because sometimes people, when they listen to the term evidence-based, they think that evidence-based work is just study or read a paper and just try to apply this in all of our athletes and we are ready to go. And the truth is, especially when we work with elite athletes, there aren't too many studies or papers or scientific research with elite athletes. So we need to be very aware of all the research we read, and we need to adjust and adapt the results and the information of that research to our own population of athletes. But this science-informed approach talks about okay, we have an injury. Let's pick up the same example as before. But the knee injury is not our main focus. So for sure, we want the knee to become rehabilitated. We don't want knee pain. We want full mobility back. But when the knee is ready, it doesn't mean that the athlete is already ready to return to performance. So we should start seeing return to performance as the athlete overall instead of just an injured body part. Because if an athlete has a knee injury, he still has another knee, 2 arms, 1 trunk, etc. When it comes to the whole process of an injury, we have the moment of injury as the start point, but before, for example, let's talk about an ACL injury. We know that most ACLs, whether they need it or not, they go through surgery. But even before injury, we have a moment pre-injury that can make our results after injury, post-surgery, can make those results better. So it even starts before the surgery in this case. And after the surgery, if we talk about surgeries, we have the traditional rehabilitation. So let's talk about the knee. It's easier to focus in one example. So we want the knee to get back to its normal function. And after, we want to put athletes in a capacity and at a level that they are ready to compete again. So when we talk about rehabilitation in this graph, this is what we traditionally do. And we assume normally that after rehabilitation, the athlete is ready to perform again. However, in between rehabilitation and return to competition, there are several parts of the puzzle that normally are forgotten. So in this graph, it's called the T5, T6, and T7, where we see return to activity, return to sports, return to play. So all these parts need to be in the program in order to reduce re-injury risk further on. When it comes to bridging the gap, in terms of the staff or the people who work around the athlete, around the injury of the athlete, we have several professionals that surround the athlete. So from the moment, if we check on the left side of this graph, from the moment of injury until the right side of this graph, return to competition, we can say that the first professional in terms of importance should be the physician or the doctors or the surgeons. Again, if we talk about an ACL injury, if the athlete is injured, the most important professional at this moment, at day one, will be the doctor in terms of either assessment, either if it's a surgery or any other medical procedures. However, it doesn't mean that only the doctor is present at the moment of day one. We also have physiotherapists and other medical staff. So we saw that, for example, in the ACL, we even have a pre-surgery program in order to increase the likelihood of getting good results post-surgery. So the physiotherapists and the doctors or the physicians probably are the two most important professionals at an early stage of rehabilitation. And this is normally well assumed by us. Normally, we do this in a traditional approach. However, if I start including the S&C coach or the performance staff since day one, this is something normally that is missing in return to performance programs. Normally there is even a fight between medical staff and performance staff. Should medical staff only be the only ones present in an early stage? Should performance staff have a role in the beginning? And the truth is, again, going back to the ACL example, if I have an ACL surgery, since day one, performance staff is very important. Because we are going to see that later on in this lecture. If I stop training, I start detraining. And if I start detraining, it will be harder when I want to return to my sport to have less injury risk. So even if I have an ACL surgery in my right knee, I still have one left leg, two arms, one trunk. I have a lot of things that I can continue to do, continue training in order to reduce detraining. And this is something really, really important. At the same time, the sports coach or the head coach or the coaching staff, even in an early stage, has a very important role. So if we talk about, especially in long-term injuries that will take some months to get back to the sport, the coaching staff is very important for athletes. Because if we are talking about a team sports athlete and they get injured, they get an ACL surgery, Uh, if they are just in the medical room, in the physiotherapy room for 5 to 6 months, or 7 months, or 8 months, whatever, the psychological impact for this athlete will be very high. So coaching staff has a very important role in terms of continue to integrating, for example, this athlete within the team, within other activities, so that the psychological impact in this athlete is lower. So we see not a silo approach where the physician ends his job and passes the job to the physiotherapist or the medical staff. And after the medical staff is done and gives the job to the performance staff. And after the performance staff is done and gives the job to the coaching staff. This is what is called the silo approach. Here we are seeing a performance continuum. We are seeing what is truly bridging the gap from rehabilitation to performance. All elements, all professionals surrounding the athlete are very important at all moments. And of course, there are some professionals who are more important in a certain stage of the process, but everyone needs to be in the same boat. Return to performance. Normally, we see return to performance as physical aspects, right? So the knee is ready, we do physical tests, testing battery, and if everything is okay, we decide that the athlete is ready to return to play. However, there is plenty of research within the last few years that show us that return to performance is not only physical, but is also psychological and is also social. So all these three things need to be present at the end of the return to performance process in order for us to decide in a safe manner that the athlete is ready to compete again. And this is what is called normally the biopsychosocial approach. And this is not only for pain, but it's also for training and performance. This is a very important part of return to performance programs. What I normally like to say is that injury is a great opportunity for change. So this is a great mindset to have for injured athletes. So of course injury is a bad thing, a bad moment in an athlete's career. However, if we start from day one, giving goals, long-term goals for the return to play or return to performance process, and we try to educate athletes for a change and telling them that being injured sometimes is the best thing that can happen to an athlete in order for them to become better. This is very important mindset to have for injured athletes. So now that we saw the what, let's go to the why. So why do we need to have this return to performance or bridging the gap between rehab and performance? And there is a dark side of sports injuries. So we see here Darth Vader, and for sure injuries, they have a very big dark side. When it comes to research, and here we can see a graph from a UEFA injury study done in football players with teams of participating over the last, in this case, for 13 years in the UEFA Champions League. We see that hamstring injuries, and this graph relates to hamstring injuries, from 01 until the season of 2013, 2014, we see that injuries are increasing over time. During this period, they saw that each year, hamstring injuries have been increasing incidence rate for 4% each year. And each year since this period, we saw big developments in terms of technology, in terms of knowledge, in terms of staff. However, we still see injuries increasing. Why is this happening? We also see that there is a big re-injury rate after an injury. So in this graph, we can see when athletes return to play within 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and 6 months. And we see that if we look at hamstring injuries, there is a 20% re-injury rate within 4 months after the first injury. So this is a very serious case, and if we are seeing so many re-injuries, it should show us that probably something is missing or not. Maybe it's bad luck, maybe it's something else, but we should think about this as well. And we see that, as I said, hamstring injuries, especially in football, especially in team sports where high-speed running is involved, hamstring injuries are the #1 injury and the injury that has more re-injury rates from all injuries. Another thing that is very interesting, and this is a study done in Qatar by the colleagues from Aspire, they followed teams from the championship for 1 season. And they tried to establish a correlation between injuries and ranking of the team, number of wins, and number of goals scored. And what we saw in this study, I repeat, in this study doesn't mean that there is a big correlation in all studies. However, there are other studies, including, for example, in the UEFA Champions League. Teams who have more injuries tend to classify or get better results in the final of the league. They tend to win more games, and they tend to score more goals. Again, correlation is not causation. So it doesn't mean that if they have injuries, they will perform bad. This is not the goal of this kind of study, but it shows us that there is a correlation between injuries and sports results. Another thing is financial aspects. What is the financial impact of injuries in sports? And here we see a graph that shows over the last few seasons in the English Premier League, one of the best leagues in the world, they are seeing a 15% increase of injuries from last season, for the last 2 seasons. And since 2012, 2013, they saw a 86% increase in money spent related to injuries. So we see that more injuries are happening and clubs are spending more money, 86% more. Of course, this is very influenced by athletes having better contracts right now. So over the last few years, there's a boom in football in this case, and athletes are making more money each season. So if a player is injured, the club is going to spend a lot of money because every single day that is not performing on the pitch, they still get their salary. So we saw that we have negative impact in sports results. We saw that we have negative impact in terms of money spent by clubs or sports entities. And we also have a negative impact in a player's career. For example, if Cristiano Ronaldo wants to win the Ballon d'Or, the Golden Boot, in a season, and he gets half of the season injured, it will have a negative impact for his career as well, not only for his team. So these are very important factors to account when we talk about sports injuries. And this is the reason why we need to take one step further when it comes to return to performance. So why do injuries occur? So this is the biggest question. Why do we see injuries? Is it bad luck? What is it? And there are several studies, several authors already through the last years. They try to establish reasons why injuries occur. And one of the things that I like is this pyramid. This is from a paper from 2018. And the further down in the bottom of this pyramid, the most important or the biggest impact it has on injury rates. And the first step we see is player recruitment. And why is this important? Because we know, as we are going to see in the next slide, that older athletes with previous injuries, they tend to have more injuries. And this is a non-modifiable factor. So if we hire or sign players for our team who are old or have big injury risk, big injury history, probably we start in the wrong path already, because my team is going to have a bigger injury risk just because of the recruitment. The second step is load monitoring. So load is what makes the athletes having injuries. If our athletes are at home, for example, let's talk about this period of COVID-19 quarantine. Our athletes are at home. Of course, they are keeping active, but I bet that we will see very, very, very few hamstring injuries during this period. Or we will see very few ACL injuries. Why? Because they are at home, they are training at a low load, at a low level, so there are no injuries. However, we know that we need load in order to perform as well. The third step is athletic development, so stronger, faster, more resilient, more prepared athletes will have less risk for injury, as we are going to see later on. Movement efficiency, injury prevention programs, and the tip of the pyramid is luck. So from the bottom all the way to the top, bottom has biggest impact on injury rates, the top has the least impact. So maybe some luck could be a factor, but there are several other things that we need to take into consideration before we consider that injuries are occurring due to bad luck. Another model, and over the years, authors try to predict injuries. They try to create models that could tell us this athlete is going to get injured or not. And traditionally, we saw in previous models, all the models considered internal, intrinsic risk factors for injury, modifiable and non-modifiable. So non-modifiable factors, we are talking about previous injury, we are talking about age, we are talking about gender, we are talking about types of anatomy. So these are things that influence injury risk, however, we cannot change it. Other things that we can change and influence injury risk are physical capacity. So things such as aerobic capacity, strength, neuromuscular control, tissue resiliency, body composition, all these things we can influence, we can modify through training or nutrition or education. So these are things that can have an impact in injury risk. And traditionally, previous models, they all assume that, okay, if I have an athlete who has previous injury, if he is old, if he's not strong, he's going to get injured. However, I know, and I bet you also know, some athletes, a lot of athletes that are pretty damn strong, pretty damn fast and very well physically prepared. However, they tend to be always injured. And we can see a lot of examples. For example, in football, we have Gareth Bale, one of the strongest, the fastest, the most powerful players in the world of football currently. And he's always injured. So why does this happen? Because in previous models, we could say this guy's not going to get injured Never. He's not going to get injured because he's very strong, very well prepared. However, recent models, they talk about a new factor. They talk about workloads. So we know that the load is what make athletes break or not. Of course, stronger athletes, more resilient athletes, better prepared athletes with no injury history, they have less risk. However, it doesn't mean that they are not going to get injured. It depends on the workload that they are exposed. So we can say with all this that injury is much more than just bad luck. So let's go to the how. We saw the what, the why is this important of return to performance. Let's see how can we return to performance. So in a brief way, if I summarize all the process, we should make our athletes at least at the same level they had before injury. So I should have a pre-injury baseline. I should know their level before injury. How was their speed, their strength, their power, their endurance, their mobility. After this pre-injury baseline, if I have an injury, I establish my return to performance program. And by the end of this program, I need to compare against the baseline. And if the athlete is at least at the level of pre-injury, we can say safely that at least he has the minimal requirements to go back to performance. Of course, in elite sports, a lot of times this does not happen because sports is all about winning. And sometimes we need to take risks. However, if we want to minimize risk, to get athletes at least at the same level as before injury is very important. So, all the process. If we go all the way from injury to performance, there are several steps that we need to take. And I'm going to divide into 4 steps, and we are going to see each one of them over on from now. First one, set a pre-injury baseline. So what is this of setting a pre-injury baseline? There are 2 types of factors. We have athlete-specific factors and we have sport-specific factors. Okay? Athlete-specific factors, we are talking about things such as strength, speed, power, mobility, endurance, everything that is intrinsic to the athlete. Sport-specific factors is what does the athlete need to do in their sport. So things that are extrinsically related to the athlete, but very related to their sport. And normally, when we look at a sport or these sport-specific factors, we are just looking at the tip of the iceberg. Because in order to be able to be ready or to go through the demands of your sport, you need to have several intrinsic or athlete-specific factors in order to be able to play your sport. And normally we forget this under the water part of the iceberg. So sport-specific factors are truly important, as we are going to see now, but the athlete-specific factors are also crucial. So when it comes to sport-specific factors, first thing we need to do is to identify the demands of the sport. So we need to look to each sport and try to see what do athletes need to do when they are on the pitch or the field or the court or the track. So, for example, what are the most frequent injuries in your sport? Is it muscle injuries? Is it hamstring injuries? Is it during high-speed running? Is it during change of direction? Are we talking about more stress injuries? overuse injuries, what are we talking about in your sport? After we have locomotor activity. What is this of locomotor activity? We are going to see in a while, in a second, what is this? But we need to know which kind of speeds does the athlete needs to move in their sport, if they jump, if they have impacts, if they have change of directions. What does the activity or locomotor activity in their sport looks like? After we have predominant energy systems, is your sport characterized by a strong aerobic capacity quality or need? Is your sport more an anaerobic lactic sport? Is it long duration? Is it short duration? And we also need to know the worst case scenarios. So we need to know within a match, which minute or which part of the match, how much work do you need to do in order to survive to that most difficult moment of play in your sport. All of these are very important to program and decide our goals during return to performance programs. When it comes to the schedule, is another very important thing, because normally we tend to look just to one match, just one training session, but we need to realize that when athletes are going back to performance after an injury, they need to be prepared to go through the tight schedule that today's sports are exposed. In the left side, we see an example of Liverpool last season, 2018-2019. During preseason, and this is very important because preseason, traditionally we assume preseason as a part of the season where the athletes need to prepare, physically prepare for the start of the season. However, today more than ever, there is even financial aspects as well related to this preseason. Teams, especially big clubs, they need to do international tours around the world in order to fulfill the marketing needs of their team or their club. And here in Liverpool, we see an example that in the preseason, so from the 7th of July until the 7th of August, in 32 days, Liverpool had 9 matches, which is the same as saying that played one match each 3.5 days. And if this was not enough, they even had 5 travel long hauls, making a total of 18,000 kilometers in flights or in travels. So we saw that they went to a tournament in the USA. So we have things such as jet lag associated. We have players that came from an off season, and a lot of them didn't do anything for 4 or 5 weeks. And probably during their vacation, they were drinking and having bad nutrition. And suddenly, within 32 days, they need to play 9 matches and be exposed to jet lag, etc. On the right side, we see a Manchester City example as well from last season, during what is called the Boxing period in England, from November, 24th of November, all the way through 5th of January. During these 43 days, they played 13 matches, which is the same as saying 1 match each 3 days. And they had 7 travel hauls, making a total of almost 6,000 kilometers. So we have 1 match every 3 days, and we cannot rest players. Most teams cannot rest players. They need to win every single game from these 13 matches. Otherwise, they lose their chance to go either to the UEFA Champions League final or to the next stage, or they maybe can lose the championship. So this is very important as well to know. What if we have an athlete who is returning from injury in November, in this example, and he needs to play 13 matches within 43 days? Is he ready to do that? Another example, in NBA. So here we see from the 18th of October all the way to the 30th of November, we see 22 matches, 22 games that players need to play. And I call for your attention in the right side of this table, where you see that Portland Blazers, this team, they played in LA on the 14th of November. 4 days later, they were playing in Washington. So in the other side of the country, with 3 or 4 hours, I'm not sure, time difference, with a game in between in Minnesota. So are the players ready after injury to do this? Are we preparing them to be able to do this when they return to sport? This is a very important question as well. When it comes to identify the predominant energy systems in each sport, we see here a continuum that I like very much from the book of Martin Boucher and Larson from last year. And they divide sports, different sports, into 3 main qualities: speed, strength, and endurance. So in this table, in this picture, all the sports that you see in the top left corner, they tend to need more strength. In the bottom left corner, they tend to need more speed. And all the way through the right side, they tend to need more endurance. What we see is that the biggest or the highest density of sports lies within the middle or the center of these 3 qualities. So, especially team sports, they need either strength, speed, and endurance. Are our athletes ready after injury to do this? When it comes to locomotor activity, this is what I was talking about. Normally, we talk about GPS data. So in sports where we can use GPS, and we have GPS available, we need to know if attackers, midfielders, defenders, whatever your position or your role within the pitch or the field of play, what do you need to do? How many meters do you need to sprint during a match? How many jumps you need to do? How many change of directions? How many sprints with a very short rest in between do you need to do? So this is very important to know as well, because only knowing this, we can expose athletes during return to performance programs in order to make sure that they are ready for the sport. This is the same thing, some data that when I worked for the Chinese Football Association with the under-17 women's national team in China, of football that I was collecting. So we should not only see one match, we should see the average of the last few matches before injury. And we should also see the hardest and the most difficult match. What do athletes need to do when they are exposed to a very difficult match in their sport? When it comes to athlete-specific factors, so factors that are intrinsically related to the athlete. We are talking about strength and power, speed, change of direction and agility, mobility and stability, energy systems capacity, body composition, and so on. So these are the things that we need to know pre-injury baseline in order to have an idea that after injury, athletes are ready to return again. And I remember, if they are at least at the same level as before injury. If we want to minimize risk, that not every time can happen. So here we can see some tests that we normally use to assess mobility or stability. So these are some of the things that can be done. These are some examples. Active and passive tests in order to check mobility and stability. After, we can see strength tests, in this case, a maximal isometric test, isometric mid-thigh pull. So this is another example. Check differences between legs as well. We can do single leg, double leg if you have a double force platform. check velocity of the bar in the weight room. So if we have all this data before injury, makes much easier for us to know the level of the athlete after injury. We can use regional tests, strength tests, in this case a short lever hamstring isometric test. The athlete is pushing the platform down with their heels in order to check local strength in the hamstring. It can even be isokinetic testing, it doesn't matter, at least you need to have some data. Here we can see the ASH protocol for the shoulder, very recent test that shows promising results to identify shoulder or upper body injury risk. Here we can see adductor squeeze strength tests. Same thing, try to establish a baseline before injury. Here we can see jumping tests, non-counter movement, counter movement tests. We can see drop tests in order to check their reactive strength through the reactive strength index. We can do this double leg, we can do this single leg. In terms of speed, we need to know their acceleration ability, so sprinting over short distances. We need to check times. We can even trace their force velocity profile in sprinting. We need to know as well their maximal velocity speed, their maximal velocity during a sprint. So we are not talking about acceleration here, we are talking about exposure to maximal velocity. And for example, for hamstring return to performance programs, this is very important. We need to make sure that our athletes, by the end of the return to performance program, is being exposed to maximal velocity, and we need to compare with before injury. We are talking about change of direction tests, for example, in this case with a modified 505 test, where we calculate not only the total time, but also the change of direction deficit proposed by Sophia Nymphus. I strongly recommend their research. Another thing that probably is related to the needs of the sport, however, is individual to each athlete, is what is the load that the athlete is normally doing before the injury. So in this case, we have a graph of high-speed running distance and how much were they doing in training sessions or matches, how much volume per week, so that we know that, especially in the late stage of return to performance programs, we are reaching their targets, so when they get back to their sport, they don't get a spike in training load. We can talk about the individual athletic profile. So this was a way that I did with the Chinese national team of representing or creating an individual profile for each athlete at the beginning of each concentration. So this is not injured athletes, but with this information, if I have this particular athlete injured, by the end of her program, I want her to get back at least at the same level as she was before injury. And these graphics are very useful to communicate with the coaching staff as well, and even with the athlete. So we set up a pre-injury baseline. Now we need to plan the progression of the program. So what we need to do from day one is, I have an injury, I need to plan all my targets that or the goal that I need to achieve in order to tell an athlete you are ready to go back to sport. And this is also very important in terms of accountability for the athlete. So if we don't create goals from day one, athletes, of course, as normal human beings, they want to go back to their sport as soon as they have no pain, or as soon as the team needs them, or as soon as some time has passed. But if from day one we establish some goals. So let's say hamstring injury. And if I establish with my athlete that, okay, you will be ready to go back to your sport when you accumulate 2 times what we do in a match. So if we accumulate what you do in the match times 2 over an entire week, if you reach your maximal velocity, if you have no pain, if your strength testing is within 10 to 15% as before injury or comparing between sides, you in that moment, you'll be ready to return to sport. So if we create these goals, athletes will become more accountable and they will understand better the process. Another important thing is this plan depends entirely on the injury. So if we have a muscle injury, if we have an hamstring, quadriceps, calf, adductor, ACL, they all need to have different goals. Because, for example, I said in the hamstring injuries, we are talking mainly, especially if the injury was during a spring mechanism, we need to make sure that our goals and our planning will be related to high-speed running and sprinting. However, if I'm talking about an adductor injury that occurred during a change of direction, probably I need also to take into consideration change of directions as well, and shooting. And if it's an ACL, the same. So we need to have goals for each particular injury, and we need to have strength and testing batteries for each injury as well. So if I have an hamstring injury, as you can see in this table, and you can check further on after on this paper, I want to have, like I showed you in the video before, for example, isohamstring tests, isometric maximal tests. We want to have isokinetic tests. We want to have... So this is really very important for us to know where we are. Another example is, okay, we need to have a plan. However, we should not see a plan as a page of the Bible that we cannot delete. So it's very important to have a plan, especially, for example, talking about an ACL, what things I can't do at a particular period or a particular stage. So during an ACL, I know that my athletes cannot start running from day one. I know that they cannot jumping or sprinting or change of direction after 1 month. Time it doesn't tell me that they are ready, but it can tell me that probably they are still not ready to do that. So it's a factor. Time is a criteria, or is a factor that can tell me the player is still not ready, but it's not enough to tell me that the athlete is already prepared to do this or to go through the next stage. So very important to have a plan of progression at the beginning of injury and start to adapt and adjust accordingly. Another thing, and this is a paper that we are going to see here, the From Control to Chaos from Matt Taberner, very, very, very good paper. And especially when we are planning the return to sport and return to performance phases. And what I mean by return to performance and sport phases is when we start to expose athletes to specific elements of their activity or sport. So everything we do in the gym is not specific. And this is a very big mistake that people normally do. Normally we tend to try to replicate specificity in the gym. It doesn't matter if you try to replicate. You will never be able to be specific in a gym. To be specific, you need to start exposing athletes to activities or locomotor activities that are present in the sport. So for most sports, we are talking about running, change of direction, sprinting, jumping, and so on. And from the early phase of this return to sport, until the end, we progress from a controlled environment where we reduce unpredictable elements such as technical elements, for example, to include a ball, but we progress all the way to the chaos. So we want athletes to be exposed to a chaotic environment by the end of their return to performance program. So this is very important to know beforehand, before we start the return to play or rehabilitation program. So we need to be aware of how do I want to distribute the loads within a microcycle, within a week for my return to sports and performance phases. Do I want to do something more intensive, something more extensive? So this paper from Matt Taberner, and we are going to see later on as well in more detail, is a very good example of how to do this progression from control to chaos. Third step, implement and monitor the program. So now that we have a pre-injury baseline, so we know where we need to be by the end of the return to performance program. We know what are our goals and how the progression of my program is going to be overall. Now it's time to implement and monitor the program itself. So when we talk about the role of athletic development, we talk about three main things. And this is very important because when we talk about return to play or rehabilitation, normally we tend to see this thing as a low impact exercise. And we will see later on that rehabilitation and training are not so different in terms of their goals and even the tools we use to achieve those goals. And when we talk about athletic development, we do this due to three things. First one, injury risk reduction. So our main goal when we work with athletes is to try to reduce the risk of them getting injured. It doesn't mean, and that's why I don't like the term injury prevention, because when we talk about prevention, it means that we are able to avoid injuries. And this is not true. In elite sports, injuries are going to happen all the time. Not only contact injuries, because those we cannot reduce risk, but even non-contact injuries are always going to happen because we saw the demands of the schedule, demands of the sport. We cannot avoid that, but we can definitely reduce injury risk through athletic development and proper education and lifestyle. The second aspect is increase sports performance. So the first thing first is I don't want to make harm. So first step, first law, first rule in athletic development is make no harm. If we don't make harm, if we can reduce injury risk, and if we can increase sports performance, perfect. This is one of the things that why we do or we try to implement athletic development from an early age. And the third is fatigue management. This is normally not so it's not so talked about in our community, but the truth is if an athlete is better prepared than another athlete for the same kind of load, they will face different physical stress. So if a better prepared athlete is exposed to a lower internal stress, it means that he will be able to recover faster and better from that stress. So better athletes, better prepared athletes, they have less injury risk, they have better sports performance, and they can recover faster from or in between training load exposures. So can we moderate the risk? Can we reduce the risk of injury? The answer is definitely yes. For example, strength. We know through research that stronger athletes have less risk for getting injured. In this study from 2019, these authors they collected data from 3 different sports, and they analyzed across seasons. They tried to analyze and establish a correlation between their strength or the load they were able to move in a trap bar deadlift 3 repetition max. So doing 3 repetitions to their limit, check the weight they could move, and make a body weight ratio. And they try to establish the correlation between that level of strength in the trap bar deadlift and injury incidence. And what they found is that if athletes cannot move at least 2.4 times their body weight during 3 repetitions in a trap bar deadlift, their injury risk starts to go exponentially up. So they have more injury risk if they are less strong in a trap bar deadlift. However, I call for your attention because these numbers should not be applied for all populations. This is something that was found in this particular study, in this particular population. So we should not pick up this data and say, all my athletes need to do at least 2.5 times body weight during 3 repetitions in a trap bar deadlift, otherwise they will get injured. What we should say is, it seems that stronger athletes are able to have less injury risk. The particular number or the particular amount of strength they need is specific for your population of athletes. So you should do and collect your own data in order to have a better insight. Another aspect is aerobic capacity. And what is being found over the last few years, and this study is in Gaelic football, a sport that is very, very intense, played in Ireland. If we have someone from Ireland over there, cheers. Very good sport. I don't understand anything about their sport, but I like watching videos of it very much. And what they did, and this kind of study is also present in football, in some UEFA Champions League teams, including with some Portuguese authors. And what they did was picking up the information of the yo-yo classic test, the running test, and they tried to establish the correlation between the athletes, the number of shuttles, total shuttles, or their last speed in the yo-yo test, and they tried to establish the correlation between that speed and the amount of injuries athletes had, or the risk of injury they have during an entire season. And what they found is that athletes with lower maximal aerobic speed, or if they reached a lower final speed in the test, or if they covered less shuttles in total, over the season, they got more injured. So again, what can we take from this data? Better prepared athletes in terms of aerobic capacity and power tend to be more protected against injury risk and against injury throughout a competitive season. Another thing, so we are talking about, so if we are stronger, if we are better prepared, it means that we will have less injury risk. However, when we analyze the data, we know if athletes train more, traditionally we see in the data that they tend to have more injury because they are more exposed, and this is obvious. So we have here a dilemma. So we know that in order to become better prepared, I need to expose my athletes to high loads, and high loads increase injury risk, but at the same time, if I'm better prepared, I have less injury risk. So this is like a circle. Is a very it's strange, but the truth is that training, we need high training loads, but at the same time those loads need to be smart, and we need to expose athletes to those loads in a smart fashion. So with this we can say that the dose makes the poison. So training can be either a poison or a vaccine. And this is very important as well to realize. And why did I say in the beginning that the traditional approach of only focusing an injured body part was probably a not very effective approach? Because of the training. Because as soon as we stop training a quality, a certain physical quality, after a certain time, we start detraining. Those qualities start to go down, start to get worse. So in this table, we can see, this is from some work of Vladimir Isurin, very good book from Block Periodization. And we can see that, for example, if we stop sprinting for, let's say, within 2 to 8 days, so within a week, I start losing my maximal speed ability. If I stop training my aerobic system, my aerobic capacity, my aerobic power, within 1 month, I start losing a lot. And I call for your attention because here we see certain number of days, and these are general. Okay, these are general numbers. It does not apply to all athletes. This is like an average, but some athletes can lose faster or can lose slower. And normally lower level athletes lose faster than higher level athletes. So with this table, what we need to consider is that as soon as I stop training, I will start detraining. And that's why I need to start training from day one of injury. Of course, training around injury. This is the key during rehabilitation and in order to reduce re-injury risk after we go back to the sport. So we can say, and this is a very common catch and phrase that is utilized, if you don't use it, you will lose it. If you don't train a certain quality, whatever it is, you will start to lose it over time. Another very important thing is that we should see training as an invasive intervention in human physiology, utilizing or using external elements. So this is a very important concept in my opinion, because if we start looking at training and exercise as something that can truly change our bodies from the inside, that can change our physiology, it stresses and it shows us that the priority in our knowledge should be physiology, biomechanics, anatomy, before we try to understand about exercises. Because if we only understand about exercises, we start falling into traps and into trends, because someone is starting using this with this athlete and is posting a video on Instagram or in Facebook, and I'm trying to do the same with my athlete. What we should know is that we can definitely change physiology, and if I can change physiology, before I try to change it, I need to understand it. And when it comes to general training concepts applied to rehabilitation, we can see, for example, short-term variables that we can manipulate and change and adapt during the rehabilitation that can have different impact on human physiology. So things such as volume, intensity, rest periods, type of exercise, type of muscle action, range of motion, intent, proximity of failure, exercise order, all these things matter. And if we manipulate one of these, we will have different physiological impact. Another thing that is very important is for us to know that we have long-term variables. That if we change frequency of a certain stimulus, if we vary, if we include variation in this stimulus, if we include progression in this stimulus, we will have long-term different physiological impacts in our bodies. So all these things need to be taken into consideration when we try to implement a rehabilitation program. When it comes to what normally people talk about periodization, I like to talk about planning over time. Periodization is just to divide the training year into certain periods, not talking about specific qualities. But when we talk about planning, this is what is called a linear approach, a linear progression, and it's called sometimes traditional periodization. This is something that I think, although it does not fit very well when it comes to training an elite athlete. So when an athlete has no injury and he wants to prepare for some sport, in my opinion, this is not very good approach for an elite athlete. If it's a lower level athlete, okay, it's okay. But if it's an elite athlete, it's not enough. This is not the best or the most effective approach according to literature and according to my own experience. But when it comes to return to sport, this is a very useful approach. So we start from low intensity, high volume, all the way through high intensity and lower volume. And why is this useful for rehabilitation? Because I know from day one, I cannot use very intensive methods because I still have an injury. I'm still not ready to handle those loads. And as soon as I go all the way to later stages in the process, I can start using more intensive methods. So when it comes, for example, in strength and power development, at an early stage of the process, I can start with more strength endurance methods, start progressing through maximum strength methods, starting to go through power, speed, and peak power rate of force development through the end of rehabilitation. So this is a very basic training concept, but it's very useful for return to performance programs. Another important thing is what is called normally people call it force velocity curve. I don't like to call it force velocity curve because I think it provides a big misunderstanding what true force velocity is. So normally we talk about the force velocity curve, where at one side of the curve we have high force and low velocity, and on the other end of the curve we have high velocity and low force. So you can see here that in the left top corner we have maximal strength, so high loads, and I'm going to explain why I call it load velocity instead of force velocity. So we have high loads during squats, deadlifts, basically powerlifting exercise within a gym. And if we start surfing the curve, we start seeing weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting variations. We start seeing jumps with loads and no loads, and plyometrics and sprinting. And normally with the force velocity curve, we consider sprinting and jumping as low force, high velocity exercises. However, if you have available at your disposal a force platform, and if you try to jump or sprint over a force platform, you will start to realize that even in jumping and sprinting, we have very, very large force demands in those activities. Although, despite the fact that they are very fast in nature. So, for example, in a sprint, we are talking about up to 5 times body weight in one leg in less than 0.1 of a second. So, should we consider this as low force? Or should we consider this as low load because we don't have any extra load implemented in this exercise? So we should be aware that different loads, different exercises have a place within this force velocity curve. Another very important thing, and I stole this from Mike Young, very good table here that summarizes all the impact that plyometrics have in the body. So we should see plyometrics, and this is a mistake that I often see, is that people, for example, in ACL rehab, they start from very early to start jumping, doing hurdle jumps with their athletes, like continuous hurdle jumps. And is that very high, very low? Is it a moderate mechanical load on the tissues and the body? And this is something, this table can help us a lot in terms of analyzing each exercise or each task if they have low, moderate, high mechanical load. So things such as height, so height of drop. So for example, if I do very low jumps, I have low height of drop from the highest point in the jump until when I hit the ground. I have low height, and this is a part of low mechanical load. So if I have low horizontal velocity or low horizontal displacement, I have low mechanical load. If my landing is rigid or if it's soft, I have low mechanical load. If I land in two legs instead of one leg, I have less mechanical load with two legs instead of one leg. So we should analyze this continuum of plyometric exercises in terms of their mechanical load. So we should start introducing plyometrics, especially during an injury and return to performance programs, from low mechanical load all the way through high mechanical load. Sometimes people are not aware, but doing, for example, single leg jumps, continuous single leg jumps over hurdles is probably one of the highest mechanical loads that we can impose in our body. Again, talking about plyometrics, even before we start jumping, we need to see this as a continuum. First, we need to be able to handle eccentric loads while landing. So we need to start exposing our athletes through landing progressions, making them, before they are very good at hitting the accelerator, the pedal in their car, they need to be able to hit the brakes. So they need to be able to brake before they are able to accelerate. And this is very important. So we should start with learn how to land, increase your tolerance to eccentric loads before you start going to more advanced methods. And this is something that we can see here in this graph. When it comes to again plyometric activities, and this graph is very interesting, a paper from last year, and we can correlate different levels of exercises or demands on each plyometric exercise according to the maximal strength that a certain athlete has. So here we can see that they divided into one time body weight in terms of their back squat. So if my weight is 75 kilos, it means that I'm able at least to do one repetition with 75 kilos. And also we have after we have another level that is 1.5 times body weight, and we have 2 times body weight. We see that if our athletes are weak, and I will not lose a long time on this, but we should see the back squat as a proxy to max strength. However, it probably doesn't tell us the whole story. I have several athletes who have very long legs, very short torso, that will never, even if they are not injured, they will never do 2 times body weight in a back squat. Why? Because they don't have the biomechanics, the anatomy, the technical ability in order to perform a back squat. It doesn't mean that they are not strong, they are just not able to demonstrate strength in that particular exercise. So we should see this information with a pinch of salt. So it doesn't mean that all the athletes need to back squat, because not every athlete is going to do it. But what we can take from this graph is that the stronger athletes can handle more intense or higher mechanical loads during plyometric progressions. So if I'm very weak, I can start doing jumping rope, I can start doing pogo jumps, and if I already have the strength levels, now I can start doing continuous jumps, depth jumps, drop jumps. So from lower mechanical load in the bottom of the graph all the way to higher mechanical load in the top of the graph. So let's see a case study. Very good paper from Matt Turbener, Van Dijk, and others, not the Liverpool football player, sorry. But this is a very good paper that I'm going just to show you what they did in this paper. I thought it was very, very good. So you can even check it further later on. So they started, this is a case of tibia fibular fracture rehabilitation. So the first traditional part of the progression was made mainly inside the weight room, inside the gym. So they started using progressions in terms of isometric strength. They started using jump landing preparation. What is this of jump landing? Is try to increase the tolerance to eccentric load. As we saw before, we start with eccentric absorption in the beginning. And later on, we can start going to jumping. They also progressed dynamic strength, so doing traditional lifts, either hip dominant, knee dominant, etc. They also used, especially in the beginning, blood flow restriction. We are not going to talk a lot about it because we don't have time, otherwise it will be another lecture. But blood flow restriction is a very useful tool in early stage of injury where we cannot use very intensive methods. They also utilize accessory strength exercises, more local, more regional, specifying certain joints or certain muscle groups. And this was basically what they did in the first phase. So this is not called the return to sport or return to performance phase. This is the rehabilitation phase. It's where we prepare the tissues so that we can later on expose our athletes to more specific elements in their program. So now I will show you some video that is present in this paper of what they did. This is the same athlete who had tibia fibula fracture. Okay, this is the different phases of progression they did in terms of, this case, plyometrics. And we see low mechanical load in the beginning all the way to higher mechanical load. And this is the last step in terms of plyometric progressions. So normally I see people starting from here, and this is very demanding on the body. This is very intensive, and this should not be the place where you want to start progressing plyometrics. This is the last phase. Okay, after in terms of strength, starting with isometric strength, iso push. very interesting here. Football players normally cannot put a bar in their back without a pad. Normally, I have an athlete in our training center who called this the pussy pad. This is the pad for pussies who have pain in their shoulders when they put the bar in their back. So here we can see different progressions from isometric progressions all the way through dynamic.
Straight on the back leg, don't carry it. Big push.
Blood flow restriction as well. I truly recommend you to read this paper. All the videos are in this paper. Great job from Matt Taberner et al. And providing this information. They are showing what they do in the real world, and it's great demonstration of a good and science-informed approach.
4, 5.
The blood flow restriction method allows us to use low load, giving a high stimulus to muscle mass maintenance.
7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, so these were some progressions in video just for you to have a better picture of what they did. And that's the first part of rehabilitation. What traditionally we are used to see is that, okay, the athlete has already their strength levels back, all is good, the tibia has no fracture anymore, let's put the athlete on the pitch making some shots, some passes, some running around the pitch, and after 1 week is back to the sport. And that's the main reason why athletes get re-injured after an initial injury. We need to have a return to sport, a return to performance program. And this is, I'm sorry to tell you, but the gym part is important, but it's not the most important thing that athletes can do during a rehabilitation. The most important thing, and the thing that is going truly to be crucial, and it's going to make all the difference, is when you start to expose them on the pitch. And this is why we need to have a pre-injury baseline. This is why we need to have a very good understanding of their sport in order to know my athlete is ready to go back. So in this paper, they did what is called the control to chaos progression. So this is in this paper, I'm not sure, but I think this started, so you can see here, it starts on the left side, it's called week 1 and to week 3. However, this is, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think this was 21 weeks after the initial injury. So 21 weeks, 21 weeks after, or 22 weeks, you can confirm it after, but 21 weeks after, they start their week 1 in terms of their return to performance program, because this is something that truly makes the difference. So what did they do? You can see here, you have the content from the left side all the way to the right side. We progress from high control all the way to high chaos. And high control means that we don't have any technical elements. we are not exposing athletes to random stimulus. When we talk about IKOs, we start including passing and running and sprinting and shooting in the end, and we have random stimulus. We need to react to an external stimulus. So this is the difference between being under control and being exposed to IKOs. And what they did was that they tried to check what did this athlete did before he got injured. What was his normal training load during the week? What was his maximal sprint ability? Because you can see here, for example, in the left-hand corner, you can see in the bottom where it says MS, it means maximal speed. And you can see that it's 63% from their max. And if you check the table all the way to the right side, they ended up in week 12 to expose this athlete to 103% of their previous max. So this means that this athlete after injury became faster than he was than before injury. And in between the beginning and the end, there was a progression. We start to expose the athlete progressively in step by step to the demands of what they are going to be exposed during their training and their matches. This is some of the work they did with on the pitch. So the athlete in this phase, it doesn't mean that he's not going to the gym anymore, but the main focus starts to be exposure to more specific elements. In this case, sprinting, change of direction, etc. So, this is some of the data that they had from the player before injury. So, his average in games was total distance almost 11 kilometers per match, high metabolic distance 2,200 meters, high speed running around 800 meters, sprint distance around 200 meters. So, this is what the athlete was doing before injury in matches, during competitive matches. They also analyzed what was the player chronic training load during the week. So they tried to compare what the players did in one single match and what they did in an entire week. So for example, this player was doing, during the training week, during training sessions, 2.2 times the total distance he does in one single match. This is all before injury. He was doing 0.4 times his sprinting distance in one match in an accumulation during the week. So this was the level that the athlete was doing before injury, and this is the level that for sure he will be exposed when he goes back to the team, when he goes back to training. We need to make sure that the athlete is ready to these demands so that when we release him from return to performance program, it doesn't get a spike in training load, so that he doesn't do his first maximal sprint exposure in a team, with a team, in a training session, but beforehand he already been exposed to that during the return to performance program. Not only in one session, but in an accumulation of several sessions. It's not only one session that counts, but it's the accumulation of total work, in this case, for example, during a week. And here you can see the progression for total distance. So in blue on the left side, you can see what he was doing during a week and during a match before injury. And when you start seeing green, all the way to the red, is from week 1 of return to performance program all the way through week 12. And you can see that step by step, they are increasing and getting closer to the level he had before injury. The same for explosive distance, the same for high-speed running. And let's say here, the athlete, when he goes back, so his chronic training load in sprinting distance was 0.4 times what it does in one match. So before injury, during a week, it was accumulating 40% of what it did in a single match. By the end of week 12, this staff of Everton Football Club, they made sure that this athlete accumulated during 1 week 0.9. Why? Because when he goes back to the team, even if he gets exposed to 100% training from early on, he's already prepared to do, because he already been doing that for the previous weeks. And this is something that is truly important to reduce re-injury risk. These are some examples here of exercise utilized with some of our athletes in our training center in Portugal. Same thing, some different variations. So this is the rehabilitation part of the program, still very general, not specific, because we are not exposing the athlete to the pitch. But this is a very important part as well during the beginning. After we see exposure to sprinting, not only expose athletes to sprinting, but also try to re-educate the way they sprint. So here, a mini hurdle wickets drill, we can see that we try to promote forward mechanics in the recovery leg in order to reduce strain and stress in the hamstrings while sprinting. Another example in China, a girl that had a female athlete that had an ankle sprain. On the right side, you can see lateral up test during 30 seconds. So that was before injury. I had data from this girl, both in left leg and right leg. And after injury, by the end of the program, I wanted her to be at least at the same level as before injury. Not only in this particular test, because this is very specific, for example, for ankle, because you need to have a lot of ankle stiffness in this test, lateral control, but also in terms of GPS data. So she had exposure to what she was already doing before she got injured. So, given this, compare against baseline. So we have pre-injury baseline, we planned the program, we implemented the program, and now it's time to check. Are the athletes at the same level, at least at the same level as before injury? Ideally, even a better level as before injury, because we cannot forget that if my athlete had initially an injury because he was not prepared, and that was one of the factors that made him have an injury, I want him to return even better than before, but at least at pre-injury baseline. This is an example that we got access from a club. This is not my data, neither our data, but this is a very good example from an injured player, where we can see a graphic, where this team, they compared what we had previous injury in terms of before injury, what we have right now, which distance in terms of percentages from before injury, and from here we can assume and know the risks of getting an athlete to the pitch. So if we have a big asymmetry or a big difference between now and before injury, probably we are taking risks. Sometimes, and a lot of times, it will happen, but we need to know the risk. This is another example from the same paper as before that we saw the tibia fibular fracture, data from Force Platform during counter movement jump. So we see that through the weeks and through the months of progression, the athlete starts to go closer and closer to his force time curve when we compare with before injury. So having all this data is very important, Because without data, and there is a saying, a phrase that I like very much, data, a person without data is just another person with an opinion. So we need to have very precise data. We need to have very good testing batteries, not only after injury, but mainly before injury. And this is why it's very important to have a very good communication, for example, during preseason testing between medical and performance staff. Because if performance staff are making tests that are not useful after injury, maybe we can include some things that will be very useful if injuries happen afterwards. So we need to always make the comparison with before injury. I know some of you guys don't work in teams or work with private clients or private athletes, and you don't have any data before injury. But in that case, you need to guide yourself through gold standards, or you need to compare your athletes with other athletes from similar populations, similar levels, so that you can know if he's already at the average level or not. Even if you don't have GPS, you can go and check what are other players from similar level doing in a match or during a training week. And now I'm going to plan my progression based on those standards. Is it the best option? No, but it's the option that you have if you don't have any technology or data before injury. So now we saw the what, the why, the how, and now we are going to see the when. So when are our athletes ready to return to performance? We divide into two factors: time-based factors, criteria-based factors. Time-based factors is what traditionally is used. So we normally say an ACL injury after 6 months is ready to return to play. However, I put you a scenario. Let's say that your athlete, and I have already worked with this kind of athlete, ACL surgery doesn't do anything for 4 or 5 months. And after 6 months, the time is passed, so after 6 months, the athlete should be ready to play, right? But he was lying down in a couch for 4 to 5 months. Is that athlete going to return to play in a safe manner? Or maybe there are some other things that are probably even more important than time itself. And this is where criteria enters the scene. So as I said, we need to compare, we need to have time in order to know, okay, this athlete still doesn't have the health and medical conditions to go back to the sport. So before 6 months, I don't want an ACL going back to the pitch. However, when we have 6 months, it doesn't mean that he's already prepared. Now I need to check criteria. I need to check, how is my athlete in strength tests? Is my athlete at the same level as before injury? Is my athlete being exposed to accelerations, decelerations, jumping, high speed running, sprint distance, velocity in sprint, as the same as he was doing before injury? This is what criteria-based is. So it's not one or the other factors. We need to use time-based and criteria-based in order to decide return to play. And as I said in the beginning, return to performance is not only physical, but is also psychological and social. So even if you have all the tests, GPS data, strength and power tests, everything is back to previous level. But if your athlete is not confident, if your athlete is stressed, if your athlete, for some reason, is not ready, not only physical, he has a very big injury risk. And there are research papers who tells us this. Even with all the strength and all the physical ability in the world, if you don't feel confident, if you have what is called kinesiophobia, you will get injured again. So it's not only physical, it's psychological and social as well. We may dream about an ideal world where my athletes are going to return to performance and they are going to return to competition when they are better than before injury. This is what I call the ideal world. However, we live in the real world. So the same as when I look at pictures at the Stone Age or at the China's Great Wall, and they are very beautiful and everything is perfect. And when I go to reality, there's plenty of crowd, completely crowded, or the sun is not shining. This is the real world. And in the real world, it doesn't mean that we will always be we will not always have our players at the same level as before injury or at a better level. However, we need to know the risks. We need to know that to put my athletes on the pitch without having the right level as before injury, or even better, we are taking risks. However, sports is about risk. It's about money, it's about winning. So the decision must be shared by all stakeholders. So the decision is not only from the medical staff. The decision is not only from the performance staff. The decision is we need to have decisions made by a team, made by the head coach, made by the board, made by athlete itself, medical staff, performance staff, and everyone should be in the same boat. So that's why communication, and there is research who tells us that communication and types of leadership, for example, in football, is very related or correlated with injury incidence in terms of a season. So communication, when it comes to return to performance, is probably the most important thing to have. Not all the technology, because we saw clubs have more technology and more knowledge than before, and injuries are increasing. Okay, the schedules are getting more difficult and tight, but with all the technology in the world, injuries still happen. So the number one thing that is most important is communication. Staff between the staff, so staff-staff communication, staff-athlete communication, and athlete-athlete communication. And when I call staff, I'm talking also about board, presidents, CEOs of the clubs or the entities that you work for. So this decision needs to be taken by all people that surround the athlete. And why is this? Because in sports, what it matters is winning. So in sports, all that matters is winning or losing. And if you have your best athlete, let's say that I work for FC Barcelona, and in a few days I have UEFA Champions League final, and Lionel Messi is with pain in his hamstring, or let's say he got an injury and is 10 days after injury. He has been working. He doesn't have pain, but we still didn't expose him to maximal velocity or high-speed running or whatever. He's not at the same level as before, but he's still Messi. Are you going to tell your coach that, Coach, Messi cannot play UEFA Champions League final because he has injury risk? With this, I bet that Messi is going to play and he will get fired. That's the most likely thing to happen, because sports is all about winning or losing, and we cannot see things such as black or white, such as this athlete is not ready, so we cannot play. There are moments where we need to take risks, and in those moments we cannot create fights, and this is why communication is so important. If we communicate this athlete has risk, but this is a very important moment for us, so let's try to protect him as much as we can. And if it goes wrong, at least we knew that there was a risk. And this is something that is not only important for the team, but also for your own job. Because if you don't have this kind of communication, if Messi plays that match, if you tell, okay, this is Champions League final, and Messi can play, everyone is going to assume that Messi is already prepared. And if he gets injured in the Champions League final, you'll get fired. So to have this communication, clear, transparency is very important to help the team, to help the athletes, and to help your own job. So, as key points of this presentation, some things. First one is that injury is a great opportunity for change. This is a clear mindset that athletes and professionals need to have during a return to play or return to performance program, because while an athlete is injured, we need to make sure that they know that this is a bad moment, but this is a moment where they can get better and where they can improve. Second is that training is an invasive intervention on physiology. So everything we do in utilizing exercise has an impact inside the athlete's body. So I need to know that by manipulating different variables to move some pieces of the puzzle, I will have a different impact on physiology. So for this, I need to understand about physiology, biomechanics, anatomy. The third, the dose makes the poison. So we know that better prepared athletes have less injury risk. We know that athletes, in order to become better prepared, they need to be exposed to high training loads. However, we also know that high training loads increase injury risk. So we have what is called a training paradox. Thank you, João Nora, for for your participation in the chat. The word was missing. So the dose makes the poison. So we can either give a smart and good training load and make our athletes better, or we can give a dumb and not organized training load and they will get injured. And last one, return to performance includes physical, psychological, and social factors. Return to performance is not only physical, psychological, and social factors are tremendously important to reduce injury risk. And sometimes athletes get injured not because they are not physically prepared, because we can see in all the testing in the world that they are ready, but they get injured. And sometimes it's because psychologically they were not prepared. So this was the last key point, and I finished saying that rehab is training in the presence of injury. This is a sentence by a quote. I'm quoting Phil Glasgow here because I truly believe in this. Rehab is training in the presence of injury. There is no much difference between rehab and training, and we need to have both in order to have what we call normally prevention. So rehabilitation and training together, this is what makes us perform better and have less injury risk, so better results and longer sports career. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for being there, and I will now check the chat to see if there is any questions. If you have any questions that you would like me to try to answer, I would like you to put on the chat so that we can spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes and we can talk a little bit about it. Let me check if there are any questions. The first question here from Emmanuel: season schedules are also something crucial to consider, right? Because we can be only working in a consequence when talking about the elite athletes, especially in the Premier League. Absolutely, as we saw, the schedule is a big part. So today, currently, the teams are playing more matches than ever. But we cannot change that. So we can either die in that scenario, or we can adapt and try to become better in that scenario. So what I believe is that athletes need to be prepared for those demands. So if athletes are not prepared to those demands, they will break. So what can we do? We can have large squads, for example, talking about team sports. We can have large squads, or we can prepare better the squad and the players that we have so that they can face those demands. Let me check further questions. If you have any questions, please put them on the chat so that I can answer. Otherwise, I will finish the lecture and the webinar. If we only use the previous average game load as a reference, we will only prepare the athlete for the load in half of the matches. Shouldn't we use the maximum values as reference? Absolutely. So we should, in my opinion, we should use both. For example, we can use the average of the last 5 matches, for example, before the injury. That will give us, for example, a month before injury. And we need to use as well the hardest match. So we also need to use the worst case scenario, not only inside one match, but given all the matches, what was the hardest moment that the player had. So we need to prepare not only for the average, but especially, as you said, for the maximum, for the most difficult game that the athlete had. In Portugal, how is the relation between medical performance and coaches? I never had at least in football, I never had the opportunity to work in a team in professional football in Portugal. I worked in China, in Chinese Super League. But from what we see is that this is the biggest problem. So the communication is the biggest problem that clubs, staff, and players have when it comes to return to performance. So normally there isn't a communication. The staff doesn't know what is going to be done in the next week, after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks. Sometimes it's a day-by-day change, and staff need to react instead of plan. So I think this is one of the biggest issues, not only in Portugal, but also in other countries. I saw the same in China. And I think it's not only inside the club, but we know that today it's a reality. Players have their own personal physiotherapists or personal physical coaches. And the communication between clubs and people that work outside the clubs with the athletes doesn't exist at all, at least in Portugal. In other countries, for example, in England, we know that this is a reality. Several clubs even integrate the outside member into the clubs for them to see what kind of training they are doing. They provide all the data. Here in Portugal, no. So this is a big problem. Next question, how would you prepare an injured athlete, Lionel Messi, that must play on the weekend to reduce injury risk? So the way that I normally do is try to accelerate the steps. So instead of progressing so slowly, try at least in the last session that you have with the athlete in your command, try to expose him as close as possible to the demands of the game. But if you are shortening phases, you will always take risk, and you need to be ready for that, you and your staff. About the hurdles, Tiago. About the hurdles placed in the sprinting exercise, what is the thinking behind it? Is it related to the technical aspect of running? How does it affect the hamstrings? So as I said, this is a task constraint, an environmental constraint as well, so that we have it's like a self-limiting exercise. So especially in team sports, there is a pandemic that is the rear side mechanics of the recovery leg. So athletes don't have any front side mechanics. Most athletes that I know, especially in football. So if you place mini hurdles where they need to step over the hurdle, they will immediately and automatically adjust their stride and their recovery leg towards a more front side dominant mechanics. And if you have a front side mechanics, you will strike the ground closer to your center of mass, so you will have less strain in your hamstrings. So this is the reason why running technique or running mechanics have influence in hamstring injuries. Of course, research doesn't tell you this because it's very hard to quantify this. However, data driven from the trenches, how it normally is called, and data driven from elite athletes and elite coaches tell us that athletes with rear side mechanics place much more stress in their hamstrings than athletes with more front side mechanics. Of course, this doesn't mean that they are going to get injured. Maybe you have athletes with very poor running mechanics who will never get injured or will never get an hamstring strain. However, if we talk about injury risk, we are talking just about one more factor. It doesn't mean that if you have this kind of mechanics, you will get injured. It doesn't mean if you have frontside mechanics, you will not get injured. It just means that we are controlling another factor. Injury is multifactorial. So I'm checking this has some delay. That's why I'm postponing a little bit. I don't have any more questions here. So you can hit me on Instagram, social media, in website. You can send me message if you have any questions, and hope to see you soon. And stay safe, stay home, take care of your own people, of your own family, and that's it. Hope to see you soon, and thank you for being here. Cheers, guys.